This is the Reluctant Leader podcast, the podcast designed to help you if you've landed a leadership role through no fault of your own and now need to find out what you should be doing. I'm your host, Mark Terrell, and have been there and know what it feels like and made all the mistakes. In each episode, I'll be getting to grips with a leadership topic by interviewing an expert in their field. You'll find out why they do what they do and take away some top tips you can use to become a more confident leader. For more content and to keep in touch with how the project is developing, go to www.thereluctantleader.co.uk. If you have any comments about the episode, you'll find me on LinkedIn, Facebook and Twitter. So let's crack on with the show. Today I'm talking to Jane Thomas. Jane has a wealth of skills and knowledge with over 20 years of both clinical and managerial experience in the NHS. She is an experienced trainer and facilitator, specialising in wellbeing management. She uses a guiding style of engagement, clarifying strengths, aspirations, and links these to evoke the person's motivation to change. Jane is a licensed specialist practitioner in motivational maps, using the maps to understand individual or team motivation, prompting behavioural changes to create a clear plan of action. I hope you enjoy this chat we had about managing stress, and I will catch you on the other side. So Jane, welcome to the Reluctant Leader podcast.
Thank you, Mark. We
met some time ago, and we share the motivational map tool that we use, and obviously we have lots of faith in that product, and we use it extensively. But we are going to be talking about well-being, and I think links back to motivation and all the other things that come from there. But before we get stuck into that, I think we'd like to know, I definitely will be, and I'm sure the listeners will be interested to know why you do what you do and what was the pivotal moment that took you down that path.
All right, Mark, yes. Well, my background is actually nursing. I trained as a nurse at Southampton General Hospital and did a little bit of work around sort of cardiology, and then went down to Poole Hospital in Dorset and worked predominantly across intensive coronary care. We're talking about well-being today, and I suppose I thrived on the fact of, not knowing what was coming through the door and having to get a team of people together and manage those quite challenging and pressurized situations at times. And then I went solely into cardiology, and fortunately, I had a cardiologist who was very interested also in sort of the psychological aspects of well-being, which can be quite unique in the medical profession. And that was trying to link sort of how we think, how we behave into what was happening physically. And we were seeing a lot of times that if people were in a poor state of mental well-being, that can also cross over into their physical health. Sadly, the work that we were doing was obviously very reactive, because we couldn't actually have a lot of communication with our patients until we actually saw them in the coronary care unit. After that, I worked with a colleague, and we were again fortunate to set up what we call cardiac rehabilitation at that Poole Hospital. And again, it was great. It was all about educating, but it still was very, very reactive. And so I approached one of my directors at the time, and we were talking about stress. Actually, we were talking about the impact that it has on absenteeism in the NHS with staff, and in those days it was very much around stress management rather than what we now look at around well-being management. And I was very fortunate, and she allowed me to go off and train in that particular arena. What became very clear to me very quickly is that stress is a little bit like a wheel of a bike. where that's in the center part of it, the hub, and off that come all these different spokes. And it linked into leadership, it linked into performance management, it linked into absence management, it linked into team building. And so I trained in all those particular areas, emotional intelligence, and then came back and eventually gave up my clinical role and actually worked for her and some of the other directors, turning teams around, looking at what we could do to help our leaders lead more effectively, to help our staff manage their well-being more effectively, and to reduce overall absence in that particular environment. And then in 2005, I left the NHS and I set up Premier Life Skills Limited. And so Premier Life Skills Limited, we now go into lots of different organisations and provide all of those sorts of training. So I suppose for me, that pivotal moment was using those skills that I'd seen right from the beginning of my career in nursing, through to actually making that decision to say, I've got to go out there now and actually get this message out there. How can we become more healthy, both physically and mentally, and the impact that will have, obviously, on our own well-being, but not just even in the workplace, on our work-life balance. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we look at the sort of tips that we need to be looking at today.
That's excellent. And I think what you say about being really active and proactive is such a key thing, isn't it? Because there is so much that goes on which is reactive. We're waiting for things to happen and then we're doing something about it. But if we can put things in place that actually are more proactive to prevent things from happening, that seems like a better solution to me wherever possible.
And I think, Mark, what's very interesting is we do a lot of work around resilience now for organisations. And obviously, we've done a lot of research around what it is and how it can support organisations. And I think, amazingly, we've looked at some studies from Harvard, and they have said that people who are more optimistic in life generally, stands a 50% chance of even having a cardiac event. And I think, if we can help people to, manage or become more resilient and learn the tools around all of that, the impact that could even have on our health service is immense, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. Good. Excellent. So let's get stuck into this wellbeing topic, which you've already highlighted and explained really, really well already. So where do we start with all this? Where can we start with wellbeing on an individual basis?
Okay, I think on an individual basis, people react very differently to stress. What might cause you stress might actually cause me to feel elated, cause me to feel that, I'm really achieving, I'm really focused, I'm really motivated. And that is why I think it can be very, very hard. It can be very, very subjective. And so as an individual, for me, one of the key points that we look at is, what is your tipping point? What are you aware of? And that could be a physical reaction. So for me, I'm very, very clear on an individual basis what triggers off what I would call that sort of stress response. And physically, what I get is a flickering of my eye. Now, some people may get that just generally, but for me, that's my physical trigger. And I know that when I get that flickering of my eye, if I don't start having a couple of early nights, making sure I'm sleeping effectively, then the next thing that happens is it affects my immune system. So I get mouth ulcers and I get a sore throat. And some of that then triggers into how I feel emotionally. So I might be feeling more frustrated. It might be less tolerant with people. And that might also link then into how I behave. So I might be a bit more irritable. So I think for me, on an individual basis, it's really trying to understand what that tipping point is. And of course, if you get to that tipping point and you don't acknowledge it, that will start to affect your performance. That will start to affect your motivation, your energy that is absolutely needed and key to enable you to manage your well-being.
That's really interesting, actually. I've never thought about that, but triggers are there. I suppose you mentioned about a physical trigger in your eyelash, and I think personally, I mine's connected with my eyes as well. When I get stressed, my eyes get really sort of dry, and So, yeah, I've never really thought about that. That's really interesting. But I guess there's also, rather than physical, there's also, other sort of psychological things and physical psychological things that come rather than physical things. So there's lots of triggers that could be going on. Yeah,
Mark, triggers can be very individual. What one person may see as their trigger, somebody else, it may not have an impact on them. So that's what we're trying to identify here, is what is it that has that impact on you personally.
Right. And I guess there is factors that go on internally and externally. And I was just remembering a couple of books I've recently read, actually, which both talked about that internal dialogue and actually and how we process what's happening to us. And I guess that's a lot to do with it, isn't it? It's how you process that information that's coming to you and how you react to it.
Absolutely. So, for instance, again, for somebody, processing of that information actually makes them feel that they've achieved, makes them feel that, they've retained their focus, that what they're doing is challenging to them, but not overly challenging. But somebody else will have that individual dialogue, which is, I can't do that. What if this happens? What if something else happens? The last time I did this, I was a failure. And that, again, when all of that is playing over constantly in your mind, what actually happens is your body puts you into what we call your fight and your flight response. So if we think of our fight and flight response as being our survival mode, we need it. The body will actually make sure that if there is a situation, so for instance, if we were to see a lion in a room, you need to get out of that room as quick as possible. Whereas if you haven't got those sort of chemicals that will actually help you to go into that fight and flight response, then there's a likelihood that you're not going to get that reaction and you're just going to sit there. And what's the consequences of that? That lion's going to attack you. But the problem in our modern day society, right, is that our fight and flight response can be triggered off by, as you say, that negative inner dialogue. So that constantly negative thought processes will still have that fight and flight response trigger, where the adrenaline, the noradrenaline, the cortisol will all actually kick into play. But the situation isn't really a survival scenario.
Right, yes, because our life is not in danger, but
no.
It's almost that we're reacting as if it is.
As if it is, absolutely, yes. And then this heightens that the way that we see things, the way that we react to those situations.
And I guess we're talking about these are the symptoms of stress, which lead on to then our behaviours that come from that and how we deal with it.
Yes.
And I guess that's different for everybody, isn't it? It's some people, I suppose, will react maybe in a almost opposite manner to they normally are. So they might become more aggressive than they normally are. Or I guess there's the other way where some people might sort of retreat into just going very quiet, maybe.
Absolutely, yes. And then so it is on an individual basis. We have an individual responsibility to be aware of that. And I think that's, when we start looking at what we do for managers in organizations, and we go in and we help managers to spot these early warning signs in their staff. And that's not about, actually accusing staff and saying to them, I think you're stressed. It's just being aware of those subtle things that start to change. But the key part of it, of course, which is the really important part, is knowing that in yourself. And that is the bit that is so important when you're looking at personal or individual well-being. Yes,
absolutely. So if we're talking about this in more of a structured way, is there a way or a model that we can think about as to how we can put this into some sort of plan?
Yes, I think so. I think that, let's say that the main thing for me is to, get people to think generally about. I sort of call it the 8 arms. I get people very much to be thinking about, first of all, their mindset. So, how do I react? Is my way of thinking more optimistic, or do I tend to be more pessimistic in the way that I actually react to situations? And so I think the mindset is really important. The other thing that I think has a big impact is often, again, when we look at this inner dialogue, can I control the situation that's going on around me, or can I influence the situation that's going on around me? And I need to examine and recognize that. And if I can't do that, then I've got to let that go. And so, that goes into question yourself. So can I change the situation? And that might be even just relating to your thought processes to that situation. Could I influence that situation? All right. And the other one there, of course, is that if I can't do any of those things, then I've got to accept that that's the way that it is for this moment in time. The next arm that I look at is very much about the body. Laughter, smiling, the times we spend with people, rather than it being something that's more sort of media based on our phones. We know that exercise is good for us, mindfulness, relaxation, what we feed our body with. The refined sugars will have an energy spike and then an energy low. How do we prioritize our time? Where's your little bit of me time? And we shouldn't feel guilty about that. Thinking again, going back to our diet, the stimulants that we tend to put in. Again, if we look at our trigger points, it may well be that our alcohol intake increases when we're feeling more stressed. It may be that our caffeine intake. It may be that, people around us, we tend to get absorbed in all of their sort of negativity. So what are the things that we need to be thinking about avoiding? Have I set myself any goals? So I suppose this links back into motivation. Mm-hmm. Where is my motivation? And then the last arm that I talk about in giving somebody a plan is support. And sometimes, we can get that support from families, and sometimes we need it from professionals. And that might be therapy, that might be coaching, that might be counselling, all of those different things. So I think for me, I tend to help people put together a bit of what I call a mind map, and use all of those 8 arms and get them to check in and have a look at what's actually going on.
Mm. And interestingly, I pick up on that. The people around us and having connections, some people have the coping mechanism of going back into their shell, and actually that could be counterproductive, can't it?
Absolutely, and we see this a lot, sadly, with the statistics that we currently can look at from Mind, where they tell us, at any time 1 in 4 people can be in a state of poor mental well-being. And that, yes, internalizing those thought processes and having what we call inappropriate thinking styles, again, can have a big sort of impact on our well-being.
Mm. Yeah, excellent. So I think at this point it'd be interesting, or a good point to mention that you're in the process of writing a book. I'm not sure what stage you're at. Are you completed, or is it just?
We are. I think we're nearly completed. Yes,
okay.
I've been invited to write a book with James Sale, who, as you know, actually created the motivational maps, and we are looking at a book called Mapping Motivation for Leadership. So I believe at this stage it's gone off to the printers, and we're just waiting now for what happens next.
How exciting! So can you give us a snippet from what we can expect from that book? Seeing that it's all about leadership.
Yes, absolutely. And I think one of the things that I think was really important is that when James and I looked at the book, one of the things that James was very interested in making sure that we included in the book was about the well-being of the leader. And, leadership is a difficult topic to write about because there's so much research around it. It shifts in different directions at different times. I think at the moment, what's very interesting is that people in the UK are now questioning perhaps some of our great leaders that we would actually think, as somebody perhaps like Churchill or Nelson, etc. And now looking at, well, were they or weren't they? So I think constantly all of these questions are being asked. And one of the things that, when we look at all these different sort of theories and practices was trying to bring something together that was practical, that was understandable for people to actually take on board and say, if I do this, if I actually practice this, I could be a great leader. And the model that we've used, which actually James used in his first book, Mapping Motivation, is actually what we call the 4+1 model. And this 4+1 model, all right, there are 4 key skills that we believe leaders need to master. And they are thinking, so how they think, doing, how they do it, building their teams and working with their teams, so team building, and motivating. Mm-hmm. Obviously, I talked about a +1. So the +1, all right, is the profound attribute of self-awareness. So it's all about that self-growth. It's about your mindset. We know that, with leadership, the elements very much link into, that motivation and that energy. We can't really do anything without that. And so if a leader is poorly motivated, it will affect their own well-being, but also over time, it will also affect their employees. And so gradually what we start to see is a loss of performance and a drop in productivity. And for me, that the well-being of the leader has a huge impact on the well-being of the team.
Yeah, and it's like a trickle down process, isn't it? If it starts at the leadership level, then it's bound to affect down through the organisation, however big that organisation, even if it's only a small team. If the leader isn't in the right place, motivated, it's gonna have an effect on pretty much everybody in that team because they're not doing their best.
Yes, yeah. Absolutely. Yes, and I think it's. I suppose I liken it to also a bit like you drive down a road and suddenly that fog comes in, and it's a familiar road you've been down, but at that point, you start to feel more anxious, don't you? You feel more sort of what's going on. I thought I knew this road, and I had a very interesting experience just lately. My son is actually over in Austria as a ski instructor, and I popped over to obviously see him, and we had 4 beautiful days of sun, and that built your confidence in what you were doing and your skiing technique. And then on about the 4th day, the fog came down, what they call a whiteout. And so I'd skied those runs time and time again, but I could see it was clear. So it gave me that confidence and it gave me that energy. And all of a sudden, you literally couldn't see 5 foot in front of you. And that, I think, then is where these skills then that we've learned are absolutely paramount to helping us through that fog, and helping us to not go off track when these sorts of things can actually happen. And it was quite, physically again, I suppose if we go into those triggers that we've talked about, Mark, already, physically, you go back to the basics. Your behavior is, oh my gosh, this is scary, this is frightening. And then, we might be thinking emotionally, can I actually do this? And yet the previous days, it was simple and it was easy. And I think, I got down that mountain and I thought that really to me is something that is actually about leadership. How do we then manage when all that fog comes around us? How do we actually manage those? What are our core skills? And I think for me, this 4+1 model is all about those core skills that when it becomes challenging, then we've got a base, we've got a foundation that enables us to carry on.
But and the +1 is so important. The self-awareness is that it doesn't matter how much thinking, doing, team, and motivation you're doing. If you're not in the right place, yeah, absolutely. That's the starting point. Yeah, absolutely. And I guess that's where a lot of people maybe go wrong. That they're not probably investing in themselves enough or putting themselves as a priority. And it goes back to when you get on the aircraft scenario, which has been mentioned in previous podcasts, is that, if you don't put your own oxygen mask on first to make sure you're in a good place, then you're not going to, eventually you're not going to be any good to anybody. So make sure you put yourself in a good place so that you can actually help others from a better place.
Which goes back again to that individual, mapping profile, as I call it, that your own prioritizing your own time management. As a leader, are you pinging off emails to your staff at 10, 11, 12 o'clock at night? When do you turn your phone off? When do you put in, the techniques that are going to help you to manage your own well-being? And if you're managing your own well-being effectively, we know that +1, that self-awareness, you are going to be a better leader.
Excellent. So I'm looking forward to reading your book, Jane. I'm sure there's going to be it's going to be a great read, and from the previous books I've read that James has co-written, they're packed full of value and highly recommended. So unfortunately, time is running out, as usual. There is these things. We've already covered a great deal of information here. And I think not what we think, it's actually what I always do, is actually end these podcasts with 3 top tips. So what would be those 3 top tips that you would leave people that are listening to this podcast so they can actually put their well-being as a priority in some way?
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting because there's 3 top tips for you as an individual generally, but also I think there are also the top tips in how you help to manage the well-being of your staff. So I think on an individual basis, as a leader, good sleep is really important. Having what I call a relaxation or a recovery tool, so something like practicing things like relaxation and mindfulness, the benefits are huge. Looking at your work-life balance. So when do you turn off from that workplace? Do you ever turn your phone off or your laptop or you stop taking emails at a certain time? So I think for me, it's very much around that. Those I think would be my sort of top tips for the leader. And then I think for the leader in helping to look at their staff's well-being, I think it's increasing that emphasis on being that empathetic leader. So being that, what I call that leader coach, looking out for the things that are, going on around you. Knowing about your staff's motivators, I think has a huge impact on staff well-being. Definitely leading by example. And then the last one for me is that, that work-life balance. So that, allowing your staff, to have that work-life balance, I think is absolutely crucial to, as we know, motivation, performance, productivity, and a happy workplace.
Absolutely. And it's showing an example, isn't it? If you're leading a team, you've got to show them the right way to do things, and you can't expect people to do things that you're not doing.
Absolutely. Yes.
Which is a life lesson that we should all take forward and make the most of. Well, thank you ever so much, Jane, for your time today. I've really enjoyed it. And I hope that we get another chance to chat at some point in the future. But for now, I will say cheerio and see you soon.
Thank you very much, Mark, and great to talk to you as well.
Thank you for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed it, please take a moment to leave a review. Don't forget to check out the Reluctant Leader project at www.thereluctantleader.co.uk. Make a note to start, stop, or continue doing whatever struck a chord in this episode. And until next time, be the best you can be.